Now, not enough is being done to tackle a rise in racist attacks, according to a monitoring group. This is the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. It says newspapers and politicians are at least partly to blame, and that the vote to leave the EU has led to a rise in what it describes as anti-foreigner sentiment. Let's discuss this with the legal editor of Spiked Online, the lawyer Luke Gittos, and the chief executive of the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, that's Saira Grant. Saira, let's start with you if we may. To what extent has there been a rise in hate crime in the wake of the Brexit vote?
Well, there has been a significant increase. I mean, reported increases, a spike, 15 to 20% more, but that is just what's reported. I mean, the line of work I do, we have had numerous calls, individuals informing us of crimes which haven't been reported as crimes, negative comments, hostility, a push, a shove, a statement, get out of my country. None of this gets reported, so we've got very high reported figures. We've certainly seen a spike post the referendum result and again at the end of July, but there's a lot of unreported intolerance that's being witnessed by people.
Luke, just in terms of the reported figures, Bernard Hogan-Howe, Sir Bernard, outgoing Met Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, said last week in the 38 days before Brexit there had been 1,400 reported hate crimes. In the 38 days after Brexit, that figure rose to 2,300. He further noted that they were predominantly being reported against Eastern Europeans. Those figures cannot be disputed, can they?
Well, no, they can't be disputed, but they should be put in context. We know that after significant events like the Brexit vote and in 2013 after the murder of Lee Rigby, we do sometimes see a spike in what are called hate crimes. We know that these incidents embolden a small minority of people to come out and express their prejudice where they might not have done previously. But it's important to recognise that these are spikes. If you look at the spike in 2013, it returned to normal in the months after the incident, and there's absolutely no reliable evidence that in the climate following Brexit, this country is a racist place. I just want to say a little bit about this report because it really is an incredibly dangerous document. It calls for the mass criminalisation of speech. It calls for a number of new free speech offences to be introduced into the criminal law. It calls for criminalisation of insults, which are technically already illegal under English law, but this calls for a specific offence. It chastises our press culture. It calls for an independent regulator of the press. It says that our political climate is out of control. This is basically a censor's charter. It's a document calling for the mass intervention by the criminal law into people's freedom of expression and their ability to form political organisations. I think it's an incredibly dangerous report built on extremely dodgy statistics. If I can just say a little bit more about those statistics, we know from both this report and the crime statistics that we've seen previously that the vast majority of the reported hate crimes that we see in the aftermath of these offences tend to be speech offences. They tend to be insults causing alarm or distress, making people feel fear. All of this is unpleasant, but it's a very broad category of offending and it covers an awful lot of behaviour. There actually hasn't been any significant increase in violence, and we can also explain the rise in numbers of these kinds of offences by the police being more willing to record what might be very minor incidents. So there's all sorts of problems with the statistics, and it's a very dangerous report.
Simon, can you tackle this question that Luke raises about the methodology? Because, some people do quibble with the methodology. They say, don't they, that there's not enough evidence. The evidential test is non-existent, they say. It's based entirely upon perception. I think something like 8% of hate crimes recorded in London were for burglary, of which a proportion were for things like the thefts of bikes, and they were recorded as hate crimes. Some people look at that and say, how can it be a hate crime to steal a bike? How can that be ascribed to an act of hatred? An extreme example, but do you take the point?
Sure, but actually it's the other way around. What the report has shown is that almost 50% of reported hate crimes are not prosecuted as such. The aggravating hate element gets dropped. A lot of crimes then get called social disorder, and we're seeing a lot of that, or are given other definitions, and the hate element, which is the aggravating element, isn't actually taken into account. Now, what we also know is that when it is a hate crime, victims actually suffer a lot more. There's an emotional damage attached to hate crimes that I suppose when your bike gets stolen isn't quite the same thing. So, you know, we have a situation, the report makes it very clear, where the aggravating factor isn't actually taken into consideration. We also know from the Crown Prosecution Service that a lot of reported hate crime doesn't get people don't get prosecuted because the identity of the perpetrator is unknown. You know, so what our criminal justice system is doing is very little, simply because in so many cases we don't even know who the perpetrator is. But can I just take issue with what Luke has said about the report being dangerous? I mean, that really is extremely dangerous in itself. Here we have an independent body, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, actually looking into and investigating what has been going on in our country for a number of years.
Saira, you don't deny, you don't dispute his right to say it, though, do you?
Of course I don't, but I'd like to counter it. I'd like to challenge it and say...
You've done that. Okay.
Can I just come back on that?
Yeah, you can.
They're not looking at what's going on in the country. They're taking statistics that have already been gathered and making policy recommendations. And this is effectively a group of lawyers who have absolutely no democratic accountability, who should have absolutely no say over the laws in our country. Can I also just pick up on
you know what, Luke,
about the methodology?
No, Luke, I know you have to save that point. We're almost out of time. I'm afraid Michael Fallon's speech rather overran, but I appreciate your contributions today. Luke Guttes, Saira Grant, thanks both very much indeed. Still to come.